Welcome to the presentation, Introducing Network-Based Education. I'm thrilled to get to share this with you. I think it's one of the most exciting things that's happening in education. Network-based education. But before I define it and say what it is and isn't, and talk about the advantages, let me tell you a little story. Marisa's story. So Marisa was one of our first students. We were doing a pilot program. And in this pilot program, the idea was that a student would have 3 mentors around him or her. So Marisa had 3 mentors. I was one. And then there were 2 more mentors, a confidant and a pastor. And Marisa, in this program, was supposed to do a number of assignments. And one of the first assignments she submitted was a church history paper. And I thought, this one's easy. It's in the bag. Why? Because I'm a church historian, trained that way. I had actually written this assignment. I had graded literally hundreds of these papers. I knew this one. And so when I was grading Marisa's paper, I saw straight away that it was a fantastic book review, great summary, great interaction. But the last piece of the prompt involved her leveling a critique of this idea. It had to do with tradition. And it was very tepid, honestly. But overall, I thought this was a B paper. It's a pass, no problem. So I consulted with the other mentors who also read it in this case. And one of the mentors said, oh, no. This is bad. I said, oh, what's bad? Oh, well, at the end, there's no critique at all. And I said, yeah, I noticed that too. I said, do you want her to rewrite it? And he said, yeah, but we really need to have an intervention. I said, why? And he said, well, because she is afraid of her own voice. She's just paralyzed. She can't even express her opinion in a church history paper. We need to have a serious talk with her. I said, okay, I'll follow your lead. So we brought Marisa in, and we had her talk about this paper. And I said, yeah, I thought it was pretty good, but Pastor wants to have a word with you. And he basically said just that. You're afraid of your own voice. You need to get comfortable with this. You need to stand up for yourself, or else you're going to get eaten alive in your profession. And she just started crying. And she said, you're entirely right. I lack such confidence. I can't even express myself to you 3 with a church history assignment. And we worked through this, and it was a powerful moment. But I walked away from it asking myself this question. This is the first question I asked. What is wrong with me? I call myself a teacher, a professor, and I don't even catch this stuff. This is the most important thing to catch, and I missed it entirely. But that question began to morph. As I thought about it over the days and weeks, I realized the question I should be asking is, why don't I have more people like that pastor who catch this stuff? Because people like Marisa are not going to telegraph this to me. They're not going to entrust themselves with this, and I'm not going to be able to catch it. But other people are, and other people will be able to have that relationship. And that got me on a certain trajectory to where I am today, talking about network-based education. Because the truth is this, I'm convinced of this. Teachers are special. I know lots of teachers. They are special. They are heroic even, but they are not divine beings. If the educational enterprise is going to be truly holistic, teachers need help from a student's network. They need help from people whom students trust and live among. And so my thesis is this, as I introduce network-based education. I want to introduce it by defining what NBE is and is not. I want to lay out a basic model of network-based education, and then explain the enormous advantages that it has, the enormous academic and financial potential for training systems. So I'm glad you're listening in on this, and we'll keep this hopefully to a short presentation because there's other stuff to cover. And by the way, I can't cover it here. I won't be covering it here, but I will cover it in later presentations. For example, essential structures to pull this off. Q&A, including things like accreditation and best practices, that comes later. But I want to make sure you understand what this is. What is network-based education? Here's a formal definition. It is a supervisory structure that uses a range of people in a student's personal and professional network to achieve formal educational objectives. Again, network-based education is a supervisory structure that uses a range of people in a student's personal and professional network to achieve formal educational objectives. To slow it down even more, it is a supervisory structure. It's not about inputs, really. It's not about people teaching or instructing. It is about other people in the network supervising, evaluating, assessing. And it's a structure that uses a range of people, really a spectrum, not one or two or three, but a dozen or more. It's in a student's personal and professional network. That is, it's not just a range of people inside a school or inside a training organization or inside a department. No, it is actually people that they know, part of their network. And this thing achieves formal educational objectives. This is not extracurricular. It's not a side item. It is part of the main program, part of the main training. Well, who's in the network? This is a big part of the definition. Well, it turns out that you can define the network very narrowly, or you can create a very wide band. But here are some people that I found are very helpful as I help organizations set up courses or whole programs in a network-based fashion. Managers. On-the-job people are really valuable, especially managers and supervisors. Mentors. And this can be defined broadly. Those that get confided in, counselors, but oftentimes just really good friends who serve in that function. Mentors, coaches, professional coaches, life coaches, even athletic coaches can play a role in this. Subject matter experts, SMEs. Oftentimes students will know people who are specialists in some tiny area. They're really good at that and they can be used for that piece. Coworkers, again, on-the-job resources. Friends, yes, friends can be used inside a network for selective objectives and with guidelines, and I'll lay that out later. But yes, nevertheless, friends and even family in select cases. And then pastors, priests, rabbis, chaplains. These folks actually have a lot to contribute, especially in religious education. So network-based education is going to use those people for formal objectives. It'll be a whole spectrum of folks. But what is NBE not? Because as I talk about this, as I introduce this casually to people, oftentimes they'll say, oh yeah, we have something like that. And that's great. Something like that is wonderful. But let me be clear what NBE is not. And if you look at some of the forerunners of network-based education, you'll see what I mean. Apprenticeships. Well, apprenticeships are great. It's really hardcore on-the-job training. It's a finishing school that can last for months, even years. It's a pedigreed solution for skilled professions, usually as people move on to become journeymen. Guilds have established deep subcultures in which students are integrated into the craft. For example, you see in the German vocational schools, they're strengthened by national unions and complex certifications. Oftentimes they have nifty little outfits that go with it. But there's a problem here. Aside from the massive commitment of resources, apprenticeships don't use a range of people, and they're certainly not in a student's network. They're still professionalized. So good, but it's not NBE. Likewise, internships or practicums. Is practicums the plural? Practica? Anyway, practicums. Internships. They're very similar here. It's a more modest finishing school. So over months, maybe a year, an employer will take a student under his or her jurisdiction. The company will oversee this person. And I tell undergrads especially to look for this sort of experience. Don't worry about making money your first year. Go out and get great experience, make contacts. Internships are a good way to do this. A practicum, good way to do it. But there is a problem when it comes to integrating this into higher education or into higher level training. Internships in schools are usually like oil and water. My experience is that it's too big of a task for the supervisor to meet all the academic requirements, and the school tends to fail too. They don't do a good job auditing. They don't do a good job understanding what's going on in the workplace. And at least categorically speaking, apprenticeships, internships, practica, they don't use a range of people in the student's network. So it's still not network-based education. How about professional learning communities? This is very hot in certain sectors. Well, what is a PLC? It's a collaboration among educational workers and entities. As Richard Dufour explains, professional learning communities become a catch-all term for people who are involved within the educational enterprise. Teams and departments and committees and PTAs and governmental agencies. And you can see how this is a network. Isn't that the same? Well, no, because PLCs concern the relationships between stakeholders in the school. It's not a mode of teaching the student. In other words, it's not a supervisory structure for the student meant to achieve formal educational goals. Therefore, PLCs, as cool as they can be, are not the same thing. How about mentors? Man, mentors are worth their weight in gold. I believe in using mentors. They're so valuable. They're so valuable, in fact, that people are monetizing this, branding themselves as professional coaches or life coaches or consultants of some sort, and that's fine. Many schools, they're setting up mentor programs, perhaps with alumni or perhaps with local business people, and that's great. But there are problems with these mentor programs. Most of the time they are unpaid and therefore unaccountable. There are vetting problems within this. But again, as far as the category is concerned, recruiting a mentor is not the same as using a range of people in the student's network to achieve formal educational goals. Most mentoring programs in the end are fundamentally extracurricular. Well, what about this? Sometimes when I share a vision for network-based education, people say, oh, yeah. Well, I understand this because I use Wikipedia. NBE, network-based education, I oftentimes call it educational crowdsourcing because it really is using the crowd to achieve learning objectives, but it is not the same as informational crowdsourcing. Now, inputs, even high-quality ones, are more accessible than ever. A student can get instruction from lots of different places, and that's great. You can still go to the library. I don't know if anybody goes to the library anymore, but that's still free last time I checked. But now there are thousands of other resources that are free or cheap. Khan Academy, Udemy, to say nothing of the thousands of podcasts, TED Talks, and YouTube videos from rogue instructors with an idea and good editing software. But there's a problem here categorizing it as network-based education. Without commenting on the quality of these resources, which is very mixed, they're all inputs. They're all geared towards providing content, which is fine, but it's not evaluation. Evaluation, supervision is thin or not there at all. So informational crowdsourcing is not a supervisory structure, and it doesn't take on formal educational goals. And so I mentioned all of this so that I can conclude that NBE is genuinely new, it's genuinely innovative and fresh, but it does have some forerunners, and we can learn from these things. In fact, I think network-based education, when done well, is empowered by the best of the community-oriented modalities and technologies. But some of you at this point might be saying, all well and good, but what the heck does this look like? Well, let me show. For those of you who are more visually oriented, here is a basic model. There are different models, but here is a basic model of network-based education. You see that the student is the circle, and then there are three different entities, instructor, coordinator, and network. These are persons or groups. So the instructor could be one teacher or professor, or perhaps several. The coordinator is usually an important role. I talk about that in a future video. And then the network, which is made up of a number of people the student already knows. Again, manager, mentor, coach, RD, somebody they know at church, perhaps a student who's already passed a competency. And you see what happens here is that the student is going to interact with all three. Those arrows in this case represent the outputs. That is the assignments or the artifacts that are produced. And the student will send this over to the instructor. And if it's a competency that's wired towards evaluation by an instructor, the instructor will evaluate that and then send it back to the student. Or perhaps send it over to the coordinator first. The coordinator, who's not a professor, but somebody who's keeping track of all of this, keeping track of the educational journey, The student might submit certain things to him or her and then get feedback back to him or her. And then the student is going to send certain things over to the network, and here's really the important piece. There will be certain educational goals, certain competencies, certain assignments ultimately that get sent over to the network, somebody in the network, and then that person is going to pass on feedback to the coordinator. Then the coordinator is going to translate that into a grade or a pass or fail or know what to do with that, and the student will be alerted to all of that. What's important here is not the exact mechanism at this point. What's important here is understanding that there's a spectrum. This is not an exclusive relationship between teacher and student. Now you're bringing in lots of other folks so that a person can have a full spectrum. More on that later. Well, that looks different, doesn't it? And you might be doubting this at this point, going, that's change. That's going to have to change our systems. Well, why is this worth it? Is it worth it? Yes, it is. Unilaterally, I have to affirm it is worth it. Let me tell you about some advantages. First of all, student experience. Students love bringing in their own people. Whenever I tell students they can use their coaches, mentors, even friends for select assignments, they get a twinkle in their eye. Really? They ask. And students who have established mentors, they enjoy going through an educational journey with a trusted companion. And what this equates to is happier students, which equates to higher retention levels. At Sioux Falls Seminary, one of the schools I've worked with, we actually saw attrition drop below 5% a year. Below 5%. If you talk to most schools, they'll say 15 to 20%, not unusual at all. And we managed to get it under 5%. Why? Because we had the right kind of people who were intercepting students at the right time, keeping students afloat in their programs. They were well supported, and students loved this. Secondly, quality of learning actually improves. Some people are concerned right away. They're going to say, aren't we dropping quality? Not necessarily. Not at all. In fact, you can improve the quality of learning, and I'll tell you why. Because network-based education forces a curriculum to get far more practical and contextual. And when you look at the theorists who are talking right now, so many educational theorists are talking about this very thing. And I wish I had more time to go into this. So, for example, Michael Phelan, he says the very premise of systems thinking is that you continually expand the context which you experience and learn from as you seek solutions to complex adaptive challenges. So learning has very much to do with context and learning to have complex adaptive challenges. And network-based education supplies that because it allows the context in which students learn. This can create a dissonance, but there's actually a kind of resolution of the dissonance as people work in their jobs and even in their homes and then in the school itself. There's an overlapping set of circles. It's a Venn diagram. That's what Julie Thompson Klein gets at when she says this about adult learners. She says adult learners are problem solvers who work with multiple forms of knowledge and information. They work with multiple forms of knowledge and information. And Klein talks about the dissonance that's created with those multiple forms of knowledge and that there's a kind of dissonance that has to be resolved. Well, using the network helps that resolution. At any level, but especially for adult learning, there should be holism, and holism requires us to desegregate our learning environments. Workplaces, even families, become critical resources. And so yes, there is an improved quality of learning, especially when you have certain standardizations that, again, I talk about in a future video. There's an improved range of evaluation. This is very much related to the second point. You just have better evaluation. Remember that story about Marisa? I missed it, but her pastor didn't. And what I found is that network-based education really shines when you can take certain competencies or certain educational goals, certain units, and outsource it to somebody when it involves a character trait or a soft skill. Because if you think about character or soft skills, the way you evaluate those is through personal means, longitudinal studies, qualitative type studies, qualitative evaluations. Do you want to know how a student deals with anger? Don't ask a teacher, ask a mentor, ask a coworker. So character, soft skills, that works really well for the network. Also evaluating skill, things that are more skill-based or psychomotor if you use Bloom's taxonomy. Practical results, hands-on demonstrations, contextualization. These things are done really well by the network. Because are you, the teacher, the best one to train a student on customized databases at their distribution company? I'm willing to bet not. Consequently, with NBE schools, they're able to go after objectives they never could before. And that's exciting in my mind. What about cost? For some of you, this is the lead consideration. Cost, the reality is network-based education will save you more than almost any other measure. And here's why. In some way, the concept is simple. If you outsource 30% of your evaluations to unpaid networkers, you're subtracting 30% of an instructor's evaluation time. So you save on staff costs. The math is a little less straightforward though, of course. Even if you outsource 30%, don't you have to set those things up in the first place? And don't you need to audit it occasionally? Yes, all of that. So maybe that 30% savings becomes a 20% savings. But here's how it can completely be transformed. Real world example. I was teaching a class and there was an interview in which the way it was set up initially was that I would interview each of these students with regard to integrity in business. 45-minute interview. So 45 minutes per student. Really, really added up. But I outsourced this and made it a network-based assessment. So that 45 minutes per student shrank. Now, of course, I had to set up things in the first place to get the feedback, but that wasn't too hard. It took a couple hours. But after I set that up, that 45 minutes per student became 45 seconds per student. All I had to do was to take that information from Google Forms and translate it into a grade. And I could show you how to do that. But 45 minutes per student turned into 45 seconds per student. And of course, I can use that evaluation mode again and again. That semester in that particular course, I calculated that I had saved 24 hours of time, evaluation time, grading time, 24 hours over the course of a semester, which it turns out was not 30% of my evaluation, or not 30% of my overall time. It turned out to be 50% of my overall evaluation time. Because even though it was like 25 or 30% of the assignments, those were the high hands-on assignments. Those were the really involved assignments that required lots of evaluation. So that 25 or 30% of the assignments actually equated to 50% of my grading time. It cut my grading time in half. That's how you save on costs. And we can talk about money later too, about how this also branches out and you can save in other ways. Finally, recruiting. Network-based education is huge for recruiting, and here's the reason why. People in the network get curious about the organization. A student comes to a guy, comes to a gal and says, hey, can I use you as a specialist in something? This person says, oh, this person trusts me. And in fact, this organization trusts me and wants to use me. And as a person begins to explore this organization, they start asking, what don't I know? Maybe I am a specialist in this area, but what don't I know? At Sioux Falls Seminary, we actually saw a number of mentors become students. They got so curious about the organization, or they got so invested in the program that they themselves entered a master's program or a doctoral program. Others were identified as donors. So with network-based education, the footprint of your organization gets much, much bigger. In conclusion, network-based education is a supervisory structure that uses a range of people in a student's personal and professional network to achieve formal educational objectives. We've talked about this as NBE, or educational crowdsourcing, or distributed supervision. But whichever way you cut it, there are incredible gains to be made on the academic level and on the financial level. And I'd ask you to entertain this question as we close out. Who have been the most influential people in your life? Which faces flash to mind? Most influential people in your life. Now, as you kind of rattle off a few in your head, 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 of them, those faces, is there a teacher in there? I hope there is, because teachers are amazing people. But is there a non-teacher in there too? I'm guessing there is. And if that non-teacher has been so instructive in your own life, so formative upon your soul and upon your life trajectory, then why shouldn't other people have that as part of their program? Why can't we use people like that in the forming of students? Well, that's what I'm hoping for. And I hope you'll take that seriously and explore even more as we look at things like accreditation and vetting and the systems that are needed to sustain something like this. It is possible and it is worth it. Thanks, y'all. I'll hope to see you again in some other video.